Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. In a moment, I will introduce the host of today's session, but before I do, I just have a few quick announcements. We'll be answering your questions at the end of today's discussion, so please feel free to enter them at any time in the chat during the webinar. And also for those who registered, we will be sending out a recording of today's sessions, so keep an eye on your email for that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the host of today's webinar, CoreALM President, Steve Oken. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Wanda. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Before we get started with today's webinar, in case you're new to CoreALM, I'm going to give you a quick overview on who we are. So I'll just share my screen quickly. Our topic for today is a product deep dive on Azure DevOps for SAP Cloud ALM. And why is this topic relevant? Well, a lot of people use Azure DevOps to manage changes across all of their applications. But of course, when you're managing changes with SAP, there's other systems that you need to integrate with inside of SAP. You need to manage transports, you need to deal with requirements, potentially automated testing. And those are some capabilities that are emerging from SAP Cloud ALM. Of course, SAP Cloud ALM is the newer version of the application lifecycle management tool that comes from SAP, kind of like the ongoing replacement to SAP Solution Manager. And we built an integration with Azure DevOps that we're excited to talk about. So before I get into that, just a little bit about who we are. CoreALM has been in business for about 14 years. The company was founded by our CEO and founder, Labana Batucci, about 14 years ago. He started CoreALM when he was at SAP. At the time, he left to start CoreALM because he saw a gap in the market where there was really no service provider that was exclusively focused on application lifecycle management, specifically for customers running SAP. And so decided to start CoreALM to do exactly that. It was about 2018 when he realized that many of the customers that he had been serving at the time had SAP, of course, as a primary application in their back office, but also had many other applications that they managed across the landscape. And for those other applications, used additional tools like Jira, Azure DevOps, and ServiceNow, and saw an opportunity to build connectors between those tools and the SAP ALM tool. At the time, it was Solution Manager, so that people could get the best use of both of those tools in combination, the best capabilities from both of those areas. And we've been expanding those connectors over time. Of course, SAP Cloud ALM is new on the scene, replacing SAP Solution Manager. In the long run, Solution Manager support ends in 2027. And so a lot of people are contemplating their migration of their journey over to SAP Cloud ALM. SAP Cloud ALM is newer, but we've been using it with customers for some time and getting a lot of good advantages from that, which we can discuss. But that's kind of the history for kind of who we are and how we got to where we are. Just quick note that we've served a lot of very large customers in this space, specifically SAP customers. Many of these we've served with providing services and helping them to implement SAP S4 or other SAP applications, as well as to optimize their change management process to help them with test automation and test management. So many of these customers have been running our tools for a long period of time with very large volumes of changes going through them, and have been very satisfied with the results. From a services perspective, we cover all aspects of the lifecycle management, whether you're doing an implementation of SAP right now or planning to, or whether you're doing a smaller upgrade project or just ongoing general enhancements. We can cover all aspects of that process and help you in providing tools that will make it easier to manage those projects. That could be from planning with requirements management or sprint planning, those types of things, build management, so execution of your sprint plan. Could be for testing with either manual test orchestration, test automation, or test case management. And then, of course, release management, taking care of transports and dealing with that as part of an overall change process. And then, of course, business process and technical monitoring is also part of it. We use, of course, SAP ALM tools, as well as other applications that go well with SAP such as Jira, Azure DevOps, ServiceNow, as I've mentioned before, but also Tricentis, Signavio, and other applications like that. So the reason for our connectors has been in the past that the SAP ALM tools do a good job of giving you control over changes within the SAP realm, but many people use other tools such as Azure DevOps, of course, as one. And for those tools, they often find that there's inconsistencies in the approach. It's very difficult to put everything together. So let's say you're trying to build traceability of requirements from your Azure DevOps tool and you're managing your pipelines through. You also want to have visibility to testing that might be done as part of your application lifecycle management. If you're using Tricentis, Cloud ALM has the ability to integrate with that so that you can actually automate your test case. So you want traceability from your requirements through your testing and through your transport management. And so really that's an example of how we make it easier to provide a consistent front-end interface using those tools, whatever tool you're comfortable with. If it's Azure DevOps, we can connect that to SAP on the back end. And that allows you to have centralized access so everybody can use the same tools at the right time. It minimizes inconsistencies for people having to double enter information and sometimes not, the data doesn't match up. And it helps with automation by using bi-directional synchronization of data going back and forth. We have connectors for Cloud ALM. We also have connectors for Solution Manager. That includes incident management, change management with Charm, and Focus Build as well. And then we have an Agile Scrum board for people that want to use Focus Build and provide a visualization on top of that that is kind of more consistent with an Agile world. And then for those that don't use Solution Manager or Cloud ALM, we also have tools to do direct transport management from your tool of choice, Jira, Azure DevOps, ServiceNow, to name a few. So this is an overall look at our products portfolio. I'm going to stop there because it's my pleasure at this time to introduce our ALM architect and Scrum coach, Valdrin Spahia. Valdrin is experienced in implementing Cloud ALM for our customers and has worked with many of them through integrations to other applications. Welcome, Valdrin.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Steve mentioned, my name is Valdrin Spahia, one of the ALM architects here at CoreALM. And in today's session, we'll go into a detailed deep dive of introduction to SAP Cloud ALM from implementation, and also the integration to Azure DevOps or ADO from Cloud ALM or Azure DevOps into Cloud ALM. But initially, we're going to start off the session by introducing Cloud ALM if you're not very familiar with the tool, and what are some of the capabilities in order for us to use Cloud ALM to implement any type of S4 project. But primarily in today's session, we'll cover such as a S4 Greenfield project, for example. Now, if you're for Cloud ALM, so it's a new ALM tool from SAP. It's a cloud a tool that's hosted within BTP, for example, and it supports also on-prem and cloud applications. Now, the goal for ALM, for Cloud ALM, is very similar to what SAP Solution Manager had in the past or offers today. However, Cloud ALM does have most of those features, including some additional features that we'll go through today. But it's primarily for cloud-centric customers, but it does support also hybrid solutions, for example, anything such as on-prem environments. Also, in addition to that, not SAP solutions as well. What you'll notice within Cloud ALM, the entire platform is redesigned, so you're not necessarily will see anything similar to what SAP Solution Manager had in the past. However, some of the features and capabilities will be similar to what are some of the terms what we have used in the past in SAP Solution Manager. So Cloud ALM does support the Activate methodology. So if, for example, anything from discover to fit the standard workshops, for example. Also, as we get into scoping and configuring the environment, including the other phases such as realize, deploy, and run. And the way we support the Cloud ALM, those different activate phases is by utilizing some of the design capabilities that Cloud ALM will offer, such as, for example, of having requirements, tasks, and user stories within Cloud ALM, including some of the processes as well. Also within build phase, you'll see that we will utilize some of those same capabilities in order for us to be able to build and then build the system and also track all of those different tasks. And then as we get, they also offer some test management capabilities, such as being able to create a test plan, having test cases, and also executing test cases, including integration to automation tools as well. From a deploy perspective, we will be able to manage transport, such as creating and deploying transports into your target environments, QA, production, etc., using SAP Cloud ALM as well. In addition to that, we've also done a webinar not too long ago on the operation side, but on the operation side, you'll have different tools and capabilities within Cloud ALM that you can utilize it to monitor any type of your environment. So an example is after you go live, you're able to use the same tool set, which in this case is Cloud ALM, in order to monitor all of your environments, depending, for example, the type of metrics that you'd like to have set up. To go into more a detailed dive, so initially when we start off a project, the idea within Cloud ALM would be that we try to take some of the fit to standard, the best practices that are offered by SAP and out of the box. And then we'll go into a little bit more of a detail in the next couple of slides, but we will be able to primarily import it depending on the environment or depending on the capabilities that you're deploying within your SAP environment. So an example, let's say if you're deploying anything such as a S/4HANA on-prem, we'll be able to automatically consume and deploy all of those best practices, including such as workflows, test cases, and etc., directly within Cloud ALM. So you can jumpstart your project by utilizing out-of-the-box best practices from SAP. In addition to that, when we get to the second pillar here on the task, within Cloud ALM, you'll have the chance to automatically bring all of the activate tasks, for example, directly in Cloud ALM. Therefore, you don't necessarily have to create these tasks from scratch, but you can have all of the roadmap tasks directly from activate that you can start by assigning those to users and etc. Now, it depends on which some of the activate tasks are applicable for your project, you can remove and you can add additional if all required. Now, usually once we go through that process of the tasks, the next step is that how do we prepare and how do we manage the testing. In addition to that, as you have your build phase, let's say, completed, you can also start by importing test scripts that are offered directly from best practices into Cloud ALM. These are also offered in a Cloud ALM format where you don't necessarily have to modify those test scripts, and they can be imported directly within the tool itself. In addition to that, there's also third-party tools such as Tricentis, including S4 automation, and also from CoreALM, a automation tool that you can integrate with Cloud ALM. For example, where Cloud ALM can become your repository or your system of record for managing the testing. However, you can have a third-party automation where it can execute those test scripts automatically and then bring back the results within Cloud ALM. And now, one of the important pieces as well on here on the change and deploy, within Cloud ALM, you'll be able to have similar to a change management tool. You'll be able to create transports and import those in the target environment. But what's also important in here, that you'll be able to separate those transports, especially if you have multiple releases, into separate releases, and it also offers some capabilities as far as being able to mass import those transports into your QA, or especially when you cut over into your productive environment. So therefore, it does some calculations and some prerequisite checks in order to have no failures during your import into your cutover production environment. So as you go through the initial step of activating the roadmap for Activate, and also the best, if you bring any type of best practices from SAP, what you'll end up is with different types of tasks and also workflows within Cloud ALM. So an example is within each one of those roadmap tasks that you bring, it's going to give you information such as here and in the bottom screen in here. I'll give you exactly what the task is, what you should do for that specific task, especially if this is assigned directly to a user. In addition to that, these can also be, for example, changed, where you can add your own flavor to those roadmap tasks. It does not necessarily have to be only from SAP Activate methodology, or you can create additional tasks if it's required. On the second screenshot in here is depending the content that you bring in from SAP best practice, you'll have a ton of workflows, for example. So you pretty much can go through your workshops by using Cloud ALM and going through those workflows, what solutions you are going to implement within the tool. Now, one of the first steps as we go through this detailed presentation is that ideally you'll start by designing the to-be solution. In this case, if you start with some SAP standard content, such as best practices, for example, you'll get a ton of what we call value flows from the beginning. And then as you dive in through each one of these value flows, you'll also get some additional detailed best practices or processes, for example, in this case, BPMN diagrams, where it's going to show that value flow in detail. What are some of the steps in order for us to execute the step? This is very similar to, for example, as we manage usually workshops in different types of tools. In this case, within Cloud ALM, you should be able to manage these workflows. Also, in addition to that, what's very important is that you can go through this workflow, add additional steps or modify the workflow, and you can also create requirements directly within the process. So this way, now you're starting to build that relationship between the process flows and also the requirements that you want to implement for a specific process. So it's all going to reside within one tool. As you go through capturing those requirements, at some point we are going to approve those requirements, and then we'll get into a build phase. Now, this is where, depending if you started with the SAP Activate roadmap tasks or not, or both in this case, you can also start to define your different phases and different sprints. So an example within a phase can be anything from realize to build to test and etc. And also within each one of those phases, you can have sprints that you can assign to the requirements tasks and also the roadmap tasks as well. This will give you a better view of how you can break down those tasks, let's say, into smaller chunks that you want to deliver, and that way you can also have complete tracking for each one of the sprints and meet those goals and those timelines that you want to deliver. In addition to that, within Cloud ALM, it's not necessarily just for us to report based on a task or in a sprint or on a phase. You can also have different types of Gantt chart, similar to what you see here in the bottom, where, for example, you can have also dependencies within that Gantt chart. So it'll give you an overall view of exactly where you are within the project, and not necessarily just in a specific phase or in a specific sprint. Now, as you get into build, into mid-build, or let's say if you have a testing phase somewhere in between, primarily we'll talk about, let's say, if you are in a integrated or in an I2C or in integration testing, for example. In this case, within Cloud ALM, you'll be able to take the best practices test cases and import them directly within Cloud ALM. Then you can modify them from there, or you can modify them in Excel and also import them within Cloud ALM. So that will give you a jump start of the test cases that you want to execute, especially if you are implementing some of the processes that are not, that you did not modify at all, for example. In this case, you can utilize those test cases out of the box. But within Cloud ALM, the capabilities that you have is that you can have test preparation, meaning that you can create test cases, you can create test steps, you can assign those test cases to users, for example, and also you can pretty much orchestrate your entire testing within the tool. Also, in addition to that, you'll have the possibility of being able to automate any of the test cases with those third-party tools that I mentioned earlier. In addition to that, you can manage your entire execution. So, and you'll get some reports, such as some basic reports that I'm showing here on the screenshot, but you'll get some additional reports where you can manage your test cases. And the most important part is that you also have full defect management within the tool, where you, anytime you have any type of issue, you can create a defect directly at the test case level or at the test step level. Therefore, you can have that traceability back to the test case that failed while you're testing. And now, as you go through these phases, usually when we get to the deploy into production or a cutover into production, within Cloud ALM, you'll also have different types of deployments that you can have. So you can have multiple deployments, multiple releases within the same project, for example. Now you can, as you see an example here, is you can define which of the transports are specific to a specific release. And you also have an option in here to approve these transports for production. So you'll have some segregation of duties where, for example, only a change manager or a release manager in this case has the ability to approve changes to a productive environment. Therefore, as you're getting closer to cutover, you can define which of the transports need to go into a production environment. And then you'll also have an option of here to do a mass import within your production environment. Therefore, it imports all of the transports at the same time directly from Cloud ALM into your other environments that are connected to Cloud ALM. In addition to that, the tool does offer, you can manage different types of system landscapes. An example is you can manage any type of on-prem landscape, such as ECC, S4, or let's say OpOps environments. You can also manage cloud environments. In this case, for example, if you have any type of CPI tools or integration suite, or any type of S4 cloud or BTP transports directly from Cloud ALM. And it can pretty much orchestrate the entire deployment between multiple landscapes, not necessarily just one. So an example is if you have transports within for your project within your S4 environment, and also let's say within your SAP integration suite, you can manage all of the transports as part of the release and deploy them together when you're ready for that production cutover. Now, in addition to that, this is just a few of the dashboards that you have within Cloud ALM, but you'll pretty much get traceability to any of the items that you log in within the tool. So an example, anything from a project, so milestones, system landscapes. Also, you'll have access to a traceability where you can see, for example, from a solution where we captured a requirement all the way to if that requirement has been tested, if type of test case, if it has any type of defect. So it'll give you all of that information within the analytics. So there's really not a need. If you just want to see the overall view of the project, there's not a need for us to go through and export this data and massage the data in an Excel or etc. You'll be able to get all of this information with some of the predefined dashboards in here. So you do have some filters that can be modified as far as the dashboards, but you do have some filters, for example, that you can toggle on and off in order for you to get a view that you'd like. So any of these tiles in here, you're able to move them around if needed to get a certain view for your project. Now, one of the most important pieces in here as well, you'll have a full traceability back between processes, requirements, and user stories. So depending on the methodology that you use for the implementation, you can get to a traceability where, for example, we can have certain requirements and certain test cases all the way back to ensure that that process that we initially had in scope, that we created, let's say, requirements for configuration or any type of RICEFs, we should be able to go back to that requirement and ensure that it also has a test case. We also made some type of change. An example, if it required a transport for it, and that if we had any defects and what are the test cases. So from a traceability perspective, you should be able to see from left all the way to the right as to what happened with that requirement before we deployed that into a productive environment. And now to introduce you to the CoreALM connector for Cloud ALM and Azure DevOps. So the idea is, for example, in many cases and many projects that we help customers with, there's always some type of third-party tool such as Jira, Cloud ALM, such as Jira, Azure DevOps, or ServiceNow, and etc. Usually, most of the time, these tools are used for non-SAP. This is where this integration comes into place, for example. So the idea would be is, let's say you're implementing in a project in SAP, and then at some point, some of the other team members are using Azure DevOps to manage their non-SAP build phase or any type of changes that they're making into the environment. This is where we can have the Cloud ALM in the example that I'm going to show you as a leading system, where, for example, we can create requirements and etc., and then we can send them directly to Azure DevOps. Therefore, the non-SAP teams can also work on the same requirements. What the integration does is we have a bi-directional, so you can create, let's say, different tasks from both tools, and then we pretty much can map any Cloud ALM and ADO issue types such as features, epics, tasks, bugs, and etc. within Cloud ALM as well. And also we can map any type of status as fields, and for example, that you want to pass between the two tools and that you want to exchange or change or sync in, etc. Now, the way I broke this down is that, for example, within Cloud ALM, if you have the solution processes that you've added to your scope, let's say this is usually your to-be solution in the beginning, the idea is that you're not necessarily going to have anything in ADO at this point. Then as you capture those requirements for you that you want to implement through the solution, let it be if it's any type of RICEFs or if it's any type of user stories and etc., then at some point we need to deliver those requirements. So you're going to have some type of project or user story. So within Cloud ALM, you'll have the option to create a project task or to create a user story in order for you to be able to deliver that requirement. So they're very similar in nature. But however, the idea is that you can integrate either one or the other, for example, in order for you to be able to deliver. So at any given time, we can have, for example, a requirement that will automatically create a feature within Azure DevOps, or vice versa. If you create, for example, a feature within Azure DevOps, it will automatically create a requirement within Cloud ALM. And then at any given time, when you create a project task for a user story in Cloud ALM, it will create a user story within Azure DevOps. Now you can also map to, let's say, multiple projects in Azure DevOps. Therefore, for example, if you have different teams that use different projects, it depending what project you wanted this task or user stories to go to, you can predefine that in Cloud ALM by a tag or anything in that nature, where you can tell it to go to a separate project. Now, defect and bug, obviously this comes later into the picture, but when you get to testing, for example, then if you use Cloud ALM for any type of testing, for example, or during the process, if you're using defect and bug just through your, let's say, your functional testing, you can, at any time when you create a defect or a bug, it will create it either in Azure DevOps or Cloud ALM. Now, keep in mind, I'm showing a bi-directional integration here, but you can make it one direction. It's completely up to you on the integration side, how you would like to map these different types of issue types between the two tools. Now, at any time when there's any type of updates For example, if you make any type of field updates, if you make any type of status updates in either tool, depending on what you map, it will automatically update it or synchronize it within the other tool as well. So all of this is real time. So it's not necessarily that we synchronize it, let's say, by a job or anything of that nature. It's based on a trigger. So at any time when there's an update, it will automatically trigger that update within the other tool and make those changes. Now, here's an example of just a brief status mapping. So when we go through the demonstration in today's demo, you'll have a great idea of what we're going to go through. But however, this is a basic mapping, for example. So let's say if you have a project task within Cloud ALM mapped to a user story in Azure DevOps, at any time when you open a Cloud ALM task or in Azure DevOps, it will automatically create one. And then in this case, anytime when you switch it to in progress, it will also do the same in the other tool. When you change it to done, it will also mark it as resolved in the other tool. So also when there's, for example, a blocked or on hold within the Azure DevOps tool, it will also put those on hold. There's also an additional status within Cloud ALM, which is not relevant, but for example, you can map it to any other status within the Azure DevOps, such as in backlog or something else. And from a field mapping perspective, so this is where just depends what field you have. You can map any type of fields that you have within Azure DevOps or Cloud ALM. Does not necessarily have to be specific. So our integration allows you to map every field that you have within Cloud ALM with any type of field that you have within Azure DevOps. Here's an example, for example, where we can map the title, we can map also the description. Also, in addition to that, what's very important is that within the Azure DevOps tool, we'll always have the link back to Cloud ALM. We'll also, in most cases, what we do is we add a Cloud ALM enabled key, for example. Let's take an example if you don't want every issue to create from Azure DevOps into Cloud ALM. So you can have a toggle such as this, where at any time when this issue is SAP specific and you want it to also be in Cloud ALM, if you toggle it to yes, it will automatically create the issue within Cloud ALM. Also, as far as the dates, as you see in here, for example, the status and the time boxes, any of the fields can automatically be integrated within your Cloud ALM, such as area, iteration, and etc. Okay, so now what we're going to go through is we'll go through a short demo of Cloud ALM. And then once we go through Cloud ALM, then we'll also dive into the Azure DevOps integration as well. So we'll go through a task as well. Within Cloud ALM, you'll have different types of tabs depending on the roles that you have. We're obviously going to go through the implementation today, which is design, build, test, and deploy. And then depending what you use within the project, you don't necessarily have to use all of these different tiles that you have here. But let's take an example. In today's, we're going to go through an overview. We'll also go through some of the processes that we talked about. How do you bring best practices? Also process authoring, so if you wanted to modify any type of workflows, and then we'll dive into requirements and tasks, for example. If you're also interested with for testing perspective, we're not going to have the time today to go through the testing. However, we do have webinars where you can join us and where we go through a detailed how to use Cloud ALM for testing as well, including automation. But from an overview perspective, this is the main area where as you log into Cloud ALM, depending on the project that you choose here, you'll have different types of tiles, and you'll have an overview of the entire project. Also, you'll have a project progress by task completion. So for example, if you want to see your overall project and how you're doing. So, and each one of these, for example, it's a drill tile. So you can pretty much go all the way down to the actual task, let's say for behind. So an example here is if you wanted to go see the tasks that are blocked, we can navigate directly to those tasks that are blocked directly from this dashboard view. So you'll have also upcoming tasks, for example, so specific to to myself. I can see all of the tasks that are assigned to me. And then there's also a ton of other dashboard depending what you're using in here. So you can modify any of these views. Therefore, you can have your own view of what you're using for, including defect distribution and etc. Now, one of the first steps usually when we get into a project is that our goal is to have a scope for the project that we are going to implement. Now, depending the type of implementation that you're doing, let's say, for example, in our example, we'll go through a S4 on-prem implementation. So if you have something in that nature, then what you can do is you can bring in all of your best practices directly from SAP. So what we'll do is I have brought in here some cloud best practices as well, but we'll go through the private edition of S4HANA Cloud. And then in here, you'll have a scope item where, for example, you can decide which one of the processes do you want to bring in. So you can decide, for example, for this specific project, what are some of the processes that I want to implement. So an example is, let's say we want to bring in, we'll pick accounts payable. So what we'll do is we'll pick the United States one. And then we'll end scope it in here. And then what you'll see is that we have now the United States, for example, for accounts payable for J60. And then when you go within this tile in here, what you'll notice is that you'll have the overview of all of those, of the accounts payable process, for example. So it'll give you just a generic overview of what it does from an SAP standards. Also gives you all of the process flows, including the business benefits. But in addition to that, there's also going to be some accelerators, such as, for example, a test script, also a test script for Cloud ALM that you can utilize to kind of speed up testing when you get to that stage. In addition to that, when you go to the status process flow or the solution process flow, so you'll have a detailed process flow in here that you can, for example, now either utilize it out of the box or you can start modifying. And then in addition to that, so any of these processes that you have in here, for example, you can generate or create a requirement directly for that specific process. So that's very important to start creating that traceability all the way back to these processes in here. Now, in this case, you have two different types of versions in here. So if I go back to my original tiles in here, you'll also have a process authoring, for example. So if you go directly into this processes authoring, you'll be able to have a draft and a published version, for example. So in this case, where I can come in here and I can make any type of modifications, but it's not necessarily going to be published for productive. But if you need to make any type of modifications in here, for example, so if I wanted just to add a specific task in here, I should be able to add it, delete it, or make any changes to these existing ones as well, for example. So I can pretty much add these tasks and then link them together and then save it and publish it. So therefore, once these are published, and for example, you create your custom process flows or add those additional steps, or if you just want to elaborate a little bit more on these processes, you'll be able to do that, include in, and then publish it so you can generate requirements or create requirements from this. There's also a little bit more that you can do with these processes. We're not going to go into the details today, but that's the idea for us to be able to add a scope that you're going to implement, modify those process flows, and then also generate requirements. But now let's also take a look into the requirements as well. You'll have a list of all of your requirements, so you'll have different types of filters on top of it that you can manage these requirements by. But our goal is to go through of generating a requirement within the tool. Let's say if you already had one, or if from a business process, or if you're going to create one. So what you'll have in here is you have a title that you can have for the requirement. So we'll just do integration to a system. Let's take an example. If you have any type of interface that we want to implement, there's going to be an integration to a third-party system, but we also have to do some, we have to also make some changes in SAP. So we'll say there's some changes for SAP and non-SAP. Now, as you scroll towards the bottom in here, so you'll have user stories that you can add, project task features, which will have transports, test cases, and also process hierarchy nodes. So for example, we can also have a process hierarchy or a BPML associated with this requirement as well. You can have documents that you can store, and then any type of references, so any type of links that you want to add to this. But also what's important in here is that you'll also have the specific solution processes that we want to tie this to. In our case, we're going to tie this to J60, let's say. And then you'll have if you want to have approvals, for example, for the requirements, it also can be an approval stage as well. So in our case, we're going to leave this in status in refinement, and then we'll mark it as a very high priority. We'll leave the effort blank. Also, for example, if you wanted to add this to a release, so I'm going to add this to a release 2. You'll have a time box and also sprints, for example, when we want to deliver this. So we'll say this is for sprint 1, and then we'll just pick a date from today into, let's say, the 26th for us to. But in addition to that, you'll also have, for example, the teams that you want to add, assigned roles, and if you want to add it to a specific person, which in this case, I'll assign this to myself. You can create any type of tags in here. Let's say, for example, what this one is for. We'll call this one localization. And then once you enter all of this information, you click save. Then this requirement's automatically created within Cloud ALM. And then you can decide, for example, what you want to do with those statuses. You can go from a proving perspective, and then as you go through building that requirement, you'll go through the predefined workflow that you have in your Cloud ALM. But this is great, but now, for example, in addition to that, in order for us to deliver this requirement, I may also need a task, for example, for us for a specific user. This is where you can create a task as a child directly for this requirement. So let's say for this integration system, we need to create a IDOC. So let's say we'll create a outbound IDOC in here for non-SAP that's going to integrate with this A system. So very similar to that, you'll also have a ton of information in here. Who do you want to assign it to, for example? So I'll assign this to myself, but you'll also have different timelines and etc. that you can add. Now, once you save it, you'll notice that, for example, within this requirement, I also have a project task. So I'll have all of this information in here. Now, what's also very important is this is the Azure DevOps feature that was created automatically when we created that requirement. And also when we go to this specific task, it's also going to have this task is also going to be created directly within Azure DevOps. But now take an example that being this is an integration, now we have another team that also has to work on this specific requirement. So this non-SAP team now, they can come directly within this specific Azure DevOps feature in here, and then they can also create their own, let's say their own user stories or their own tasks they need to deliver for this integration. Now, in this case, this came directly from Cloud ALM, so it has all of the information, including the start, the end date. So really, any of the information that we enter within Cloud ALM, it will automatically come into Azure DevOps. Now, as a non-SAP user, in this case, this is where you have the option, for example, if I wanted to add a new item for me to deliver this integration. So what I'll do is I'll create a new item. As a child, in this case, it will be a user story. So we'll say map fields to system A for SAP. So now, based on this integration for this third-party system, whatever that IDOC data that it's going to bring, I need to map some fields, but I also want to add this as a task that I want to perform, that I need to perform as a user. So in this case, you can enter any type of information in here. So we'll just say map fields. ABC. Now, this is what's important in here is But you'll also have this Cloud ALM integration. So now this being a non-SAP task, you can decide if you want to create this in Cloud ALM or not. In our case, we're going to say yes, because our goal is to kind of have the traceability back into Cloud ALM for all SAP and non-SAP tasks. So if we toggle this to COM enabled yes, and it's automatically going to create this within Cloud ALM as well. So what we'll do is we'll save this. And then what you'll notice is if you just give it a couple of minutes in here, it will automatically, it will create. So what I'll do is I'll refresh it. It will automatically create also this task within Cloud ALM. But what's also very important when we navigate to this task, it will create it in here, for example, let's say create an IDOC as a project task. But in addition to that, as you can see, it put that directly under that requirement. So now you have, for example, the specific one that we created in SAP, and then you also have the one that was created in ADO. So in this case, you'll kind of start to build that traceability where regardless if the team members are using Azure DevOps or if they're using Cloud ALM, for a specific requirement, as long as that requirement is either created in Azure DevOps and it's in Cloud ALM, you'll be able to create these child stories, for example, so that's where you can manage all of these within Cloud ALM or Azure DevOps. Now, even with, for example, as we go into Azure DevOps, you'll have, for example, all those children. So now at any given time, if I wanted to make any type of changes, let's say if I wanted to mark this as a result, and then if you go back into SAP Cloud ALM, what we'll notice is that, for example, now that requirement, it's also completed as well. So, and then at any given time, if you wanted to see, let's say, any type of history and etc., who made these changes, you'll see automatically that you'll have this integration that made all of these changes between Cloud ALM and Azure DevOps. As far as the integration goes, the mapping is completely dynamic. So from a status perspective, you can map any of these statuses that you have within Cloud ALM or Azure DevOps to any of the statuses that are within Cloud ALM, including any of these fields that you see in here, such as plan, and or if you have any type of custom fields. All of those you'll be able to map between the two tools. So for example, anytime when you create it, when you modify it, it will automatically update the other tool. And from a customization perspective, the fields that you have in here, you don't necessarily have to have them visible. You can hide these fields from a Cloud ALM integration. But from our case, the only prerequisite that we have from deploying this application, that you'll have some additional fees that you have to create within your Azure DevOps, and then obviously the deployment within Azure DevOps in order for you to be able to have this integration in place. That was the goal today, is to kind of give you an idea how the Cloud ALM works, including the integration between ADO and a release, I would say a simple scenario where we have both SAP and non-SAP working on the same requirement, and then also creating those issues regardless of the tool, right? So in this case, Azure DevOps. So feel free to ask any questions.
Thanks, Waldron. That was a great tour through Cloud ALM, the capabilities there, as well as the integration with Azure DevOps. We do have some questions. The first question is around how do we ensure that features that are agreed upon at the beginning, like for instance, requirements, security, all of those things for a project are implemented and released as approved. Any comment on that?
So the tool does have a workflow. So at any given time, for example, you're able to look into all of the features and different types of statuses they are in. Also from a traceability and history perspective, you're able to see who approved or who changed a specific status to a feature. So at any given time, you can review it by phase, by project, by sprint. Therefore, you'll see, or individually, which features are approved, which ones are ready to be, let's say, designed or built, or even ready to be promoted to production.
Awesome. And perfect. So having testing traceability as well is important. So lots of different tools that you can use to make sure that you have full traceability, but that's a very common goal. Next question talks about installation. What does it take to get this tool installed, and how long does it take to get things up and running?
Installation perspective, there should be anywhere from, it's an out-of-the-box solution. There's a deployment required within the Azure DevOps with a subscription. But other than that, for example, it should be less than a couple of days in order for us to deploy the integration.
Okay, great. I think that's all. If any of you have any additional questions, feel free to log them into our website. You can go to CoreALM.com. That's CoreALM.com. And in the top right corner of the screen, you'll see a Talk to an Expert button, and then you can enter in your questions there. Also, please do join us for more exciting webinars. CoreALM.com/resources, or in the top right corner of our screen. Also, you can just click on the webinars button and you'll see upcoming webinars on many different topics. We also keep an archive of all of the historic topics that we have run in previous webinars, and you can request access to those videos and watch the full-length video for those. Thank you very much, Valdrin, for the detailed walkthrough. Thanks everyone for joining us today. If you're watching online, hope you tune in and watch additional videos. And please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.